Last time we argued or we talked about populations and samples, that samples are drawn from a population. This time, we're going to talk about some of the process of doing that and how a sample can be biased by the way that we sample, that we pull um, responses. So Sam there are a number of different ways that we can sample. One way is convenience sampling, where we're sampling only those people who are easy to contact. And you see here that response rate to phone calls has dropped across time. And that certainly is a problem in terms of because people who are responding are probably different. So, we might look at this graph and conclude that there's probably some bias as a result of what we're seeing here. And phone polling is, as a result, going to be problematic. Think about whether you just pick up the phone for someone who you don't know. And think about who picks up. That's probably different too. Even think about, do you have a landline? Do you know what a landline is? And that those factors can then influence our sample in a lot of undesirable ways. Now, we can also have some self-selection in sampling. So only selecting those people who volunteer, as opposed to true random selection. So, this survey was drawn from online, and if think about who responds to online surveys. Probably only internet savvy people and only people with certain kinds of interests. I don't generally respond to surveys online. So think about how the data were gathered and then what this graph says. And what kinds of conclusions you'd want to draw from it. As opposed to this one, which is probably more a representative sample, where AAA is contacting people throughout the country and asking about a series of different kinds of driving kinds of behaviors. Because they're using a representative sample, they are much more likely to get results that we feel comfortable with. So I've already begun to lay this out, but there are non-probability samples. We've talked about convenience samples, for example. And then there are probability samples, which are really what we're more interested in, where all members of a population of interest have an equal and known chance. And that means that when we're seeing differences, we can trust that it's not due to the sampling process, but something about who they are. So in our non-probability samples, we have a number of different things that we may look at. Convenience samples, where we're talking only to the people that we know, for example. Voluntary response samples, where perhaps some people self-select, Purposive samples where we are actively choosing certain kinds of people, and snowball samples where we might ask, gather some people who ask other people who ask other people. So, for example, I may want to know about how people with HIV handled the pandemic. And so I might talk to two people with HIV who contact their friends and ask them to respond. And then quota samples where we are specifically choosing particular members of a population in order to respond to our survey. Then there are probability sampling strategies. Simple random sample is when we are random sampling and everyone has an equal probability of being chosen. So we may choose various people's names out of a hat, for example. Systematic sample is when we're using, for example, a random numbers table, and that tells us who the next person chosen should be. Stratified samples are again where we're trying to balance our sample in some way. And we are choosing those members based on how frequent they are within the population. Cluster samples, we're choosing clusters of individuals, perhaps members from two different schools, to become involved in our research. So let's go back and look at Natalie Dean's article, where she's talking about how do we know who has COVID and how can we best track COVID infections. So what if we track who comes in for testing? Probably the people who come in are going to be different from the people who don't come in. Maybe the people who come in are higher in conscientiousness, or perhaps they are more sick, more ill, and they need hospital services. Those people who get COVID and only recognize that they had COVID because they did a home test kit before they traveled, probably they're not going to show up here. What if we only test our friends and neighbors? That's probably going to introduce some biases. I was on a call recently, and everybody else on the call had talked or had multiple people that they knew who had died of COVID. I didn't know anybody. And so if they were doing a measure and I was doing a measure, we'd get very different experiences of the impact of COVID within our population. Now, on the other hand, we might want to know about a very small at-risk group. So perhaps we might want to know about people with MS. And we might look at a specific sample of people with MS, either in our county or in the nation. And that's okay. Although we'd probably only want to generalize to people with MS rather than saying that everybody behaved in this way. So we're going to make a distinction here. I've sort of talked about a little bit about the differences between random sampling and random assignment. So random sampling is when we are choosing at random members of the population, maybe through a random numbers table or by drawing numbers out of a hat or names out of a hat. Random assignment is when we are taking participants or potential participants and assigning people at random to become involved. It's only used in experimental designs as a way of increasing internal validity. Okay. Now, there are a number of different examples in the PowerPoint. I've only chosen one here that I'm going to be talking about. In each one of these, I want you to be thinking, is this random sampling or random assignment? So in this case, the American Automobile Association, AAA, conducted a survey using a random digit phone dialing system to call a national sample of 2,000 US drivers. Drivers were asked whether they'd ever talked on a cell phone while driving. Random sampling or random assignment? And this is random sampling, right? We are using the random digit phone dialing system to randomly sample from our population. We are not assigning them to groups. This is not an experiment. I'm going to stop here and take care. Bye-bye.